Hello and welcome to TVP World. Here we are in Poznań at the Impact 2026 Summit. I'm Diana Skaya, and my next guest here is Alice Han, the director and partner at Greenmantle, a global financial advisory firm. Alice, thank you so much for taking the time for being able to join us here and to talk, of course, about the latest developments taking place between President Trump and the president of China, Xi Jinping. Now, Trump is, they both held a first round of talks. Trump is in China. He was greeted, of course, quite incredibly, right, by the Chinese president. What's your biggest takeaway so far? And more specifically, I'll ask you, what do you think will come out of these talks? I mean, I understand there's not much that we know yet, but what do you think both leaders are hoping to achieve altogether?
Well, thanks so much, Diane. It's great to be here with you. So I think one of the biggest symbolic images from Trump landing in Beijing after, being there only in 2017, so a decade ago, is the fact that you had the CEOs of NVIDIA and Tesla, the founder of Tesla, Elon Musk, the CEO of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, accompanying him right behind him as he landed on Air Force One. And I think that is a signal very much to not just China, but the rest of the world that the US and Trump are open for business. He wants business deals coming out of this summit. I'm more skeptical that they will actually come to any kind of trade or technology export restriction related agreements. I think this is a vibe summit where we set up for future meetings some kind of deal that's ironed out on those levels. But I think we may actually see some business announcements on the margin, say China buying more agricultural products, Boeing aircraft. We just heard an announcement that the H-200s will be given to 10 Chinese companies. It remains to be seen if China will accept those imports. But I think this will be largely contained to positive vibes and business. The real elephants in the room are Taiwan and Iran, as you know. On the Taiwan issue, I've sensed a bit of a softening in Beijing's tone. They obviously want to defend, their principles over Taiwan, but I do not expect any real, pressure on the Americans to change the rhetoric or really deal with the Taiwan issue, except maybe to delay some of the arms sales that they agreed to at the end of last year, $11 billion in arms sales to Taiwan. And on the Iran issue, probably the most important issue. That's
exactly my next question to you,
yes.
Right? So let's start maybe on Iran, but on the China aspect first. Now, China, of course, is one of the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, right? Does that, you think, is the Hormuz crisis severe for China?
So I think this is a key question. As you rightly point out, 90% of Iranian sanctioned oil was being bought by the Chinese. China depends on 50% of its energy, LNG, gas, oil from the Middle East via the Strait of Hormuz. But what has been interesting, and this is a real industrial policy that goes back to at least 2 decades, is China in the run-up to this crisis was massively supplied in terms of its strategic reserves. It created buffers to try to weather this kind of storm. It's a system that is built on redundancies. It wants to reduce any kind of crisis. So it's done that pretty well. And even although we see crude inventory levels down 16% below pre-crisis levels, they've moved very quickly to try to, plug the holes importing from Russia, North Africa, Brazil. Yes, China is being hit by it, but not as badly as I think many, even experts, would have assumed going into the conflict. And that, I think, reduces the short-term incentive for China to play nice with the Americans and collaborate with them over Iran, even though Trump will be pitching this. Last point, if this drags out longer, I would say over past the summer, the most important, risk to the Chinese economy is the hit to exports. Because remember, if the rest of the world, especially the Asian countries who are oil and energy vulnerable,
right,
see a demand destruction, a hit to growth, that will have a knock-on effect for Chinese exports.
So do you think, in other words, that Beijing now has real influence over Iran on the U.S. administration?
So Beijing has real influence over the Iranians. It has invested a lot in the relationship with the Islamic Republic, not only through trade, but also through technology aid. Before the conflict was giving the Iranians their own satellite system, as well as certain missile capabilities and weapons. But I don't think that they will, even though they have that capability, use their influence over the Iranians to benefit the Americans, because from a geopolitical standpoint, they like the fact that the Americans are bogged down in the Middle East, that they're alienating their Gulf allies and their European allies, remember.
This is China you're talking about.
This is China, exactly. It benefits them geopolitically because then they can play this card of China as peacemaker. And I think it's one last point, very interesting that the Chinese are taking the backseat and letting the Pakistanis be the real front row seat drivers as the back channel. But I'm sure that they are, behind the scenes being involved in those discussions. They just don't want to be seen to be facilitating the peace process for the Americans.
So in other words, China is playing its cards perfectly well.
Well, there's obviously the risk to my previous point that if this draws out even longer, that the rest of the economy could be in some kind of recession, technical recession, and that is not great for China. So even though right now it looks like they're playing their geopolitical, energy, economic cards right, the real risk is if this prolongs as a conflict and if we live in the new normal, just like in Russia-Ukraine, a new normal of forever war, which means that oil supply, at least for the foreseeable future, is severely hit.
You did mention, Russia, Ukraine. Before I head into, how this is affecting Europe, how do you think that Moscow is reacting to Trump visiting Xi Jinping?
Well, it was interesting that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, was in Beijing not but a month ago. It seems that he was being briefed on Trump's imminent meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing, but also he was there to prepare what will be, I think, Putin's trip to Beijing in the days after Trump leaves.
Right.
So I think that connection between Moscow and Beijing is stronger than ever. There is a huge personal relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping. And coming out of the conflict, on the economic dimension, with oil, with Brent north of 100 for the foreseeable future, that benefits a massive oil supplier like the Russians, right? But also more importantly, having a weakened Middle East that is more divided, with the UAE pulling out of OPEC, with it being TBD as to how powerful Iran will be, or Israel relative to Iran. I think Russia benefits from this kind of Middle East uncertainty and crisis, right? Because the Americans and the Europeans will be somewhat distracted. But at least from my standpoint, is the one big takeaway is that the axis of ill will, so to speak, so North Korea, China, Iran, Russia, have been strengthened from the Iran crisis and not weakened.
EU exports to China are falling, while EU-US trade is surging. Now, this global imbalance is doing well?
Well, it depends on what perspective you take, right? I worry for the Europeans that as we look to the next frontier technologies, and it's not just artificial intelligence, it's also the hardware side of things, so robotics and chips. It is being left behind increasingly, not just by the Americans on the software side, but by the East Asian countries, not just China, on the hardware side. What I mean by that is if you look at even the market cap of Korean equities or even Taiwanese equities, they've now surpassed British equities in the stock market. That is a warning signal of what is actually happening on the ground, is that as the US is looking to do a $1 trillion AI capex this year cycle, who is producing and providing the hardware for that? That is East Asia. It's Taiwan, it's Korea, it's Japan, and increasingly China. And so I worry that Europe is going to be crowded out. We look beyond the deficit and the surplus, because what we've learned from both trade wars, in Trump's first term and second term, is that those numbers really belie what is actually happening. What do I mean by that? If you look at the trade, for instance, deficit between the US and China, that's really halved since Trump came into power the first time. But we've actually still seen a massive increase in the US's trade deficit globally. And that suggests to me and to other observers that China is simply re-exporting through other countries, Southeast Asia, Latin America, with the final destination being to the US. So I think looking at bilateral trade balances can often be an illusion. What is more important is what are the capabilities in the cutting edge technology and in industrial policy. And right now it seems like China, East Asia, the US are at the forefront of the next revolution in technology.
And Europe is behind?
Correct. They have the talent, but they just don't have the industrial base and the policy making to put it all together.
But they remain divided, right? I mean, we have, policymakers saying, de-risking, not decoupling. Do you think that the Europeans, because they're divided, they actually have, they could actually come together to challenge China, right, and its markets, or respond to the certain imbalance that's happening?
Well, I mentioned this previously in one of my talks, that I think Europe needs to learn from China. I don't say this as a way to endorse China's model, but I say that in every model there are strengths and weaknesses. And in the China model, what China learned from 2017 when Trump was lost in China is that supply chain risk is a national security risk, and that a lot of technology is dual use. So what did they do since 2017? They went line by line and looked at the supply chain downstream to upstream and figured out, hey, where are we missing? Where can we plug the holes? Do we need to buy up factories or plants, get the R&D, or invest in mines to make sure that we have supply chain resiliency? I think Europe needs to, and Brussels need to really come together and go through the hard work, line by line, not just on defense capabilities, but in technology, to figure out, hey, on rare earths, for instance, we are lacking in a supply chain. That is, I think, going to be the important policy direction for Europe.
Speaking also of that, what about the electric vehicle tariff negotiations, right? How is that? I mean, they've been stalling for a little over a year now.
Well, here I think politics trumps economics. Europe is trying to pursue what is a goalist policy of strategic autonomy, especially at a time where Trump is putting a lot of pressure on transatlantic allies. So by getting closer to China, we've seen a flurry of European leaders going to China earlier this year. Merz, in a surprise move, has even said that he might even negotiate a free trade agreement with China. I don't think that is the right policy direction, and my concern is that it is not really helping build the industrial base for the future for Europe. So if they take it seriously, I think there are parts in which we could have a win-win, as to borrow Chinese terminology, which is, you do a reverse technology transfer. You bring, just as the Japanese did in the 80s after they had tariffs put on them by Reagan and export restrictions, do incentivize Chinese companies to build fully European factories with their technology.
Thank you so much, Alice Han, for breaking it down for us here. The unfolding events, of course, taking place in China between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Diana.
And that's all here from us at the Impact Summit in Poznań. For TVP World, I'm Diana Skye. I'll see you next time.